All right. You guys ready? The good news is we're getting close to like halfway done with the class, which is exciting for everybody. Today's lecture is maybe one of the hardest that we'll do all summer. So today we're going to be talking about enzyme kinetics and inhibitors. And Brad is likely going to really like this lecture because it's a lot of math. So we're going to work in the realm that you're comfortable in, I think. But just a couple reminders before we get into today's lecture. There's a difference between lyases and ligases. Don't mix these up. So lyases are the addition or removal of groups to form double bonds. Ligases use ATP to put two substrates together. Don't confuse those two. And then remember, there are some common things about active sites that you should all keep in mind. We have a 3D cleft or crevice, and that can include distant residues. So things can change drastically in these active sites, and we saw that a little bit yesterday. Again, these are only a small part of the total enzyme volume, but there's a minimum size requirement of approximately 100 angstroms. They create unique microenvironments, so even outside of the enzyme, just in that active pocket or that active site, it has a relatively unique microenvironment. Remember that nonpolar microenvironments enhance binding, but they can contain certain polar residues. And substrates bind to enzymes due to multiple weak interactions. In general, you don't want non-reversible interactions. If you have non-reversible interactions, and we'll see this today, you can actually get suicide inhibitors, or you can get inhibitors that will never release and completely shut down an enzyme. And remember that the directionality of hydrogen bond can give specificity, and specificity depends on that very precise arrangement of atoms. So just a couple of things to remember about active sites when you're trying to identify them in some of your questions. And then the last reminder is that your binding energy, again, is the free energy released upon interaction between the enzyme and the substrate. And it's greatest when the enzyme interacts with the transition state. So TS is transition state. So remember, you have your substrate and you have your product, and then you've got your delta G double dagger. And that is what's changing based on your enzyme, and your enzyme is lowering the transition state. And so if your enzyme interacts with that transition state, you actually get a very good interaction. And that's the greatest when you're actually interacting with the transition state. So let's start with a case study. Patient X is a 55-year-old woman who presents recently because she's been experiencing memory loss. She works 2 jobs, is always tired. She has a familial history of Alzheimer's disease, although typical onset of the disease does not occur until late 60s or early 70s. Recently, she has had her genome sequenced with 23andMe. The results show normal levels of BACE1 and beta secretase. So remember, beta secretase is the enzyme that's going to cleave off that little end of the APP protein and lead to the agglomeration in the tangles that you get with Alzheimer's disease. So what's going on with patient X? Any ideas? Think about what we've been talking about and what we're talking about today. So it turns out that here's beta secretase right here that's cleaving. Remember, that cleaves the amyloid beta peptide, and it cleaves off that N-terminal end, and that's what goes and forms those clusters, right, that you see in Alzheimer's disease. So this is the rate-limiting step for the formation of Alzheimer's disease. So it turns out in Alzheimer's disease, there was a relatively recent study, recent I guess in scientific terms, that came out in 2006 and is suggested that there's a change in the Vmax, which we'll learn about Vmax today, but there's a change in the way that the enzyme binds, and it binds with a different affinity. And so if it's binding with a different affinity, it's going to change the rate at which this happens. So if it changes the rate at which that happens, it can change potentially the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So even though the amount of enzyme may be the same and the amount of the gene may look the same and you don't have any known mutations, you can get changes in onset of Alzheimer's just strictly based on the activity of the enzyme and the kinetics of the enzyme. So today we're going to explore Vmax, and we're going to talk about a lot about Michaelis-Menten kinetics. So enzyme kinetics is basically the rate at which compounds react. Again, here's just another way of looking at, here's our reactant and our product, and we have this huge hump or this huge wall to climb over without the enzyme, and with an enzyme, the wall gets lowered. So again, the rate of enzymatic reaction can be affected by the enzyme. It can be affected by how much of a substrate you have. It can be affected by other effectors, and we'll talk about what some of those could be. And then it can also be affected by temperature. So those are kind of the 4 areas that you should look at if you have a change in the rate of reaction. So why should we study this? Why should we care about this? And specifically, why should you as pharmacists care about this? So again, this allows us to determine the order of binding of substrates. It allows us to do all this acid-base catalysis, find effective inhibitors, and this is the biggest one for you guys, is how do we discover new drugs? How do we find effective inhibitors? And how can you tell what's going to interact with each other based on the kinetics of those enzymes? So there's a very defined way in which we measure enzyme kinetics. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we design good experiments. How many of you guys have ever done lab work? A little bit? Okay, you've been in the lab at least a few times. And so when we talk about doing lab work, a really important part is trying to define what is our positive control and what is our negative control, because that's what allows us to interpret our reaction. So here is the way that they actually work on this. They mix an enzyme and a substrate, and then they look at the rate of the substrate disappearance, and then they plot the velocity versus the substrate concentration. So V naught, or V sub 0, is the initial rate that it happens. And then you change the substrate concentration and you repeat it. And you keep doing this over and over. So again, your positive control might be the most or the maximum amount of substrate that you're going to put in. Your negative control would be maybe you're lacking the substrate or maybe you're lacking the enzyme. And then you look at how much product increases over time until you reach an equilibrium. And so here is our substrate concentration, and we'll talk in a minute about what Km means. And here we are reaching a certain saturation level. And so we have this dead time between mixing and the start of the measurement, and then we have an initial velocity. So this is what Michaelis and Menten did. Now, Lenora Michaelis and Maud Menten came along and they thought, well, there's got to be a way that we could mathematically describe the way that enzymes act and the rate at which they act. And so that's what they did. They started out by taking a look at the maximum velocity that a reaction could occur at, and then they looked at the substrate concentration, and they looked at the reaction velocity over here. So here's our max, and we're going to approach Vmax. Now, Vmax divided by 2 is going to be what we call the Michaelis-Menten constant. And that occurs at a certain substrate concentration. And so when we look at how this equation is derived and how all these factors fit together, that's the part you're going to have to know. You're going to have to know these equations. So the ideal rate is V equals Vmax times the substrate concentration divided by the constant, the Michaelis constant, plus the substrate. However, this is our ideal, and lots of things can make our ideal change. So we could have a limitation in our measurement. We could be inhibiting our substrate. We're going to talk a lot about what happens when we inhibit our substrate and how that changes some of these constants and changes the rates. And then maybe we have an inhibitor that we're unaware of, or maybe the enzyme has an inhibitor that we're unaware of. So there's a couple different things that can happen here to change this ideal rate, but this is our ideal rate. So remember that we can saturate this equation in many cases. So we can just keep adding more substrate. And then that will, in theory, in some cases, make this go faster. So that's when we start approaching Vmax. So remember that our Michaelis constant is 1/2 of Vmax. And then here's our V sub 0 over here, and our substrate concentration is over here. So there's a couple steady state type things that we have to make some assumptions about. Remember, yesterday we talked about steady state being our 25C and our pH, right? And those were our steady state. And so we've got some steady state things that we have to talk about here too. So the first thing we have to remember is that when we add our substrate and our enzyme together, the rate of this enzyme substrate transition state, okay, so this is your transition state right here. The rate that happens, that those two interact, has a specific rate. It's got a specific rate constant, and we're going to call that K sub plus 1. And sometimes that transition state, if the activation energy is too high, is going to go back, and it's going to split apart into your enzyme and your substrate again. And sometimes it's going to go forward, and it's going to produce your product and then your enzyme. Because remember, our enzyme isn't consumed. So we're going to convert our substrate into our product. So the question is, at what point do we have more product, or is this way more favorable than going back this way? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out. So V sub 0 is equal to K2, right here, times the rate of ES, or the concentration of ES. So that means that we've got the concentration of the of the transition state times the rate constant at which that transition state converts over to the product. And that's going to be V sub 0. So that's a steady state. And when we break that down even further, we know that K1 times the concentration of the enzyme times the concentration of the substrate is equal to the rate at which the transition state goes backwards plus the rate at which it goes forwards times the concentration of the transition state. Questions so far? As long as you can keep in mind that you've got this transition state, you're kind of sitting on the top of the wall, and if you get really tired, you're going to fall off the wall one way, and otherwise you keep climbing and you go over the wall the other way. And so the rate at which those two things happen is what we're trying to balance. And that's what this is showing us here. So then when we rearrange that equation, we can come up with this particular equation down here that tells us that all of our rates can be gathered together on one side, And then we can have that the concentration of the enzyme times the concentration of the substrate divided by the concentration of the enzyme substrate complex, or the transition state, is equal to the rate at which it's going to go back plus the rate at which it's going to go forward divided by the rate at which the transition state is formed. So far, is everybody here? Okay. And essentially, that's what Km is. That's the Michaelis-Menten constant. So the Michaelis-Menten constant is the rate at which the transition state goes backward and produces more substrate and enzyme, plus the rate at which it goes forward and produces product and enzyme, divided by the rate at which the transition state is produced from the substrate and enzyme. That's the Michaelis constant. Km is the rate at which we get the transition state going backward to enzyme and substrate, plus the rate at which it goes forward to product and enzyme, divided by the concentration, or divided by the rate at which it's produced from the substrate and enzyme. So that's down here. That's Km. That means that Km is equal to the concentration of the enzyme times the concentration of the substrate divided by the concentration of the transition state. Because this is Km. Okay, so now that we've confused ourselves with Km's and K's and K minus ones and everything, let me throw in a little extra. So remember that Km is approximating the dissociation constant of the enzyme substrate complex, or the transition state, only if K minus 1 is much, much greater than K sub 2. So when it's much, much greater, remember that K minus 1 is going backwards and K2 is going forwards. So if K minus 1 is much, much greater than K2, then that means that we're going to take and break apart this transition state. So we're going to disassociate it. So in that case, Km is approximately the dissociation constant. Now the cool thing about Km is because it's due to all these rates, it can be independent of, it's got units of concentration and is independent of enzyme or substrate concentration. So enzyme concentration shouldn't really matter, substrate concentration shouldn't really matter. So we can then define the concentration of the transition state is the concentration of the enzyme times the concentration of the substrate divided by Km, divided by all those rates. And that should be our concentration of our transition state. Now, our enzyme and the amount of enzyme that we add in, that's our enzyme total. And that enzyme total has to be reflected in the amount of enzyme that's bound to the substrate and the concentration of the enzyme that's unbound. And that gives us our enzyme total. So the amount of free enzyme, which is unbound enzyme, is equal to the total amount minus the concentration of what's bound to the substrate. Because remember, we never see that part that's bound to the product because that's when we convert it and the enzyme is released. Yes, so this is the amount of enzyme that's unbound, or free enzyme. So we can plug in for our free enzyme here this equation. And now we have everything in terms of the amount of total enzyme, the amount of enzyme substrate complex, the substrate, and here's Km, which is our rates. Now we can use this equation to go back to our initial velocity. And this is what talks about and tells us whether or not our concentrations matter in our initial velocity. So when we rearrange this equation, we can end up seeing that we've got our enzyme substrate complex is equal to our total amount of enzyme that is added to the entire reaction times the concentration of the substrate divided by the concentration of the substrate plus Km. But because we know that initial velocity is K sub 2 times the enzyme substrate complex, we can now plug that in here, giving us our initial velocity. So now we know our initial velocity. We know how that relies on our concentration. We know how that relies on our rates. And remember, as long as you can figure out that you've got an enzyme plus a substrate, goes to a transition state, and then that transition state can either go backwards and get disassociated to your enzyme substrate, or it can go forwards and become your product and your enzyme. You can understand this part. So the maximum rate at which this can occur is V sub max. So remember how I taught you about with beta secretase in Parkinson's disease, or sorry, in Alzheimer's disease, they saw a change, an increase in the Vmax of beta secretase. So this is exactly what happened. So Vmax is equal to K sub 2 times E sub T, which is the total amount of enzyme. So if your bound substrate is equal to the total amount of substrate, because that's as much as we can get bound, we can substitute this in. So we can substitute the equation for Vmax, because remember Vmax would be this part here, which tells you, this is the Michaelis-Menten equation, that the initial velocity is equal to Vmax times the concentration of the substrate divided by the concentration of the substrate plus the Michaelis constant. We've just derived Michaelis-Menten equation. So a couple other little things to keep in mind, because you will need to be very proficient at using this equation and plugging different pieces in and remembering that we can take K sub m and it's substituted for those rate constants for K minus 1 plus K2 divided by K. So a couple more substitutions. V sub 0 equals 1/2 of Vmax. Keep that one in mind for sure. K sub m, the Michaelis-Menten, will approach the substrate concentration when V sub 0 equals 1/2 max. So if K sub m, the Michaelis constant, is equal to the substrate concentration, you will get 1/2 of Vmax. So that is how you derive Michaelis-Menten equation. It's incredibly important for us understanding how enzymes work and the rates at which they work and how it happens if we, like what's going to happen to it if we change the amount of substrate we put in versus what's going to happen to it if we change the amount of enzyme we put in. That equation and all of those sub-equations that we talked about to derive the Michaelis-Menten equation can help you figure that out. So you're going to want to know each one of those different, Vmax is equal to this, and V sub 0 is going to be equal to Vmax when this happens, and you need to know all of that. Because when it comes to doing the calculations on your test, we're not going to be giving you these equations. So variations in the Michaelis-Menten actually have physiological ramifications. So here are two enzymes that play a key role in metabolizing alcohol. So here is alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase. This is what they look like here. When you talk about alcohol dehydrogenase, you have the zinc that comes in. Is zinc, what classification do we usually think of zinc as for enzymes? It's what? Remember, that's that table that we talked about, and there was manganese and magnesium and NAD plus and cofactors, yes. So zinc is a cofactor. So we've got zinc. Ethanol comes in here. NAD is an analog that comes in here. And so alcohol dehydrogenase is up here. Aldehyde dehydrogenase is down here. We can see that we're producing protons, so it makes a big difference. So in some people, they respond to alcohol consumption by facial flushing, rapid heartbeat, symptoms caused by excessive amounts of acetaldehyde in the blood. So why would they have acetaldehyde in the blood? Well, the reason why they have it is because there's two different acetaldehyde dehydrogenases. One with a low Michaelis-Menten constant and one with a higher Michaelis-Menten constant. So if you have a low Michaelis-Menten constant, the low Km enzyme is inactivated in susceptible individuals. So they don't have that fast Michaelis-Menten. So the enzyme with the high Km can't process all the acetaldehyde. So some of it appears in the blood. And that's why you see that. So here's normal alcohol metabolism, and this is the accumulation of acetaldehyde in the blood. You'll know this. You'll know this now. You have acetaldehyde in your blood, and we should. This is how that works. So this is consequences of when the Michaelis-Menten constant is off, or when it's altered. So we've now seen what happens to beta secretase if you've got a change in Vmax. And now we've seen what can happen if you have a change in the Michaelis-Menten constant. So Michaelis-Menten isn't always linear. A lot of times we think about it as linear. I showed you some graphs. It's not always linear. And in certain cases, we should use nonlinear to calculate Km and Vmax. But there are cases where it is linear. And these are double reciprocal plots, which are also called Lineweaver-Burk plots. So remember, if you see kinetics that is linear, you're looking at a Lineweaver-Burk plot. If you see something that you approach a saturation level, you're not. So those are these double reciprocal plots. And they're really good for analyzing two substrate data or inhibition data. So we usually look at inhibition data using Lineweaver-Burk plots. So basically, this double reciprocal equation, which is shown right here, is the Lineweaver-Burk equation, and that's what we use to produce those linear equations. And this is what it looks like. So you'll need to know, when you talk about Lineweaver-Burk plots, you'll need to know about the intercept, that the intercept is equal to 1 over Vmax. So if I give you an intercept and I ask you to find Vmax, you should be able to do that. You should know that the slope of the line is equal to the Michaelis-Menten constant divided by Vmax, which means that we can set, because of this common Vmax, we can actually put this all together, and that your intercept is -1 over the Michaelis-Menten constant. And the intercept is going to change when you talk about inhibitors. So when you're looking at Lineweaver-Burk plots, and you're trying to figure out what kind of inhibitor you have, you want to make sure that you're going to be looking at where that interceptor or that intercept is. And you'll see that here in a little bit. Yeah, we don't want to do calculus, though. Brad wants to do calculus. Do you guys like calculus? Yeah? A lot of you do? We could have done it by calculus, but
no one ever uses by calculus.
yeah, so well. Anyway, okay, so remember that you've got first order reactions. This is going to become incredibly important to you guys when you talk about pharmacokinetics, because you have first order drug release, you have zero order drug release, and that makes a big difference in terms of your dosing schedules, right? Because if you're not eliminating it at the same rate as you're taking it, then you end up having this increase in the amount in your plasma or in the amount of your blood. So it's a first order reaction. Again, it's directly proportional to the reactant concentrations. Here's your slope is minus K, which means that the reaction at any time T is proportional to the concentration A. And A sub 0 is the initial reaction concentration. So remember, first order reaction rate's incredibly important to you. That's kind of like the gold standard. You want either zero order or first order when you're designing drug release systems. Second order reaction rates, they're okay. You're still going to end up having a fairly good drug release. But again, second order reaction rate constant is based on this bimolecular reaction or using two reactants. So the rate, again, is proportional to some power of the concentration greater than 1 squared. So you've got your concentration of reactant here and the rate of reaction over here. You don't really need to know that part. You just need to know what the curves look like, if it's a first order or a second order. So we've talked about a lot of these different enzymes over here, but these are the Michaelis constants for some of these enzymes. You have chymotrypsin right here with your substrate. Here's your Michaelis constant. It's very, very high. You have carbonic anhydrase, again, very high. And then you have like lysozyme that's got a very low Michaelis constant. And here's your tRNA down here with even the lower Michaelis constant. So they all have Michaelis constants, but they also have turnover rates. And we talked a little bit about turnover rates, and we didn't define it this way yesterday, but now we're going to define it. So here's Kcat. Now, Kcat is basically the rate at which your enzyme turns over. So Kcat can be related to the rate K sub 2. So if your enzyme concentration, again, total is known, then your Vmax is equal to K sub 2 times your total enzyme concentration, which means that K sub 2 is your Vmax divided by your total enzyme concentration. So now we're just solving that. But K sub 2 is also called Kcat, or the rate at which your enzyme gets turned over.
I like this to go back to the stickase example yesterday. This is how many sticks that may process per second.
So how quickly does it process?
So again, if your enzyme is Pac-Man, how many times does it jump? That's what the Kcat comes with. How many numbers of molecules per product per second?
So we know that Kcat is actually this equation here. Definitely know that part. Know that Kcat and K2 are the same. Okay, so that's the turnover. So that's a speed. It's the number of molecules of substrate converted to product per second. So if K sub m, or the Michaelis constant, and Vmax, it allows the determination of E sub s, or the fraction of enzyme bound to the substrate. So we can determine the fraction of enzyme bound with this equation here.
So your velocity for enzyme, how fast it goes will depend on concentration, right? This is logic, this makes sense. If there's fewer molecules sitting around it, it can process less because of endpoint interaction. Right? Kcat is the turnover number, and it's independent of the concentration. Hopefully that makes sense. That's like your how fast your car can drive, right? How fast your car can drive depends on how much gas it takes.
So KCAT is as fast as you could possibly go. So again, we saw these yesterday, but these are some turnover numbers or some KCAT numbers for these enzymes. We see that carbonic anhydrase, we're turning over 600,000 per second, but lysozyme, we're turning over 0.5 per second. So if we go back and look at our Km, our carbonic anhydrase is 8,000, and our lysozyme is 6. So what does that tell you about the relationship between KCAT and Km? They're proportional. Are they directly proportional or inversely? So lysozyme is very small, and it has a very small turnover rate. So yeah. Which means if your Km is small, your enzyme sticks around longer. Yes, thank you. So again, if you divide KCAT by Km, that tells you your enzyme efficiency. So how good is this enzyme? So again, if the concentration of S, or substrate, is much smaller than Km, then we can minimize this equation by essentially getting rid of this, and we figure out that V sub naught is equal to KCAT divided by Km times the free enzyme times the substrate. But if the free enzyme is essentially equivalent to the amount of total enzyme, you get this equation. So we're just substituting in a whole bunch of different things. The problem is you have to know all those different substitutions. That's where it gets kind of tricky. And as you can see, you can easily confuse yourself. So again, the reaction rate is limited by K1. Remember, K1 is the rate at which your enzyme and substrate combine to give you your enzyme-substrate complex or your transition state. So that is the limitation here. It can't go any faster than the diffusion-limited interaction of your enzyme and your substrate. So some enzymes have that ratio that approaches the rate of diffusion, and so such enzymes are considered catalytically perfect. We also know that things are rarely perfect. So you can approach that, but rarely are you going to reach that exactly. So ratio of KCAT per Km. So when we do all the algebra, not the calculus, at the end, we find out that the final form, in the case of a single substrate, is that the velocity is equal to KCAT times the total enzyme times the substrate concentration divided by the Michaelis constant plus the concentration of the substrate, where KCAT is the turnover number, Km is the Michaelis constant, and so it depends on the details of the mechanism. So here again, we're looking at enzyme efficiency. We can gain efficiency by having high velocity or affinity for a substrate. And so here are enzymes where we approach the diffusion control limit, which is listed here. And so you've got a variety of different enzymes here. You don't really need to know this. You just need to know that if your KCAT over Km approaches the diffusion limit, that's a catalytically perfect enzyme. That's the part you really need to know. So that's all single substrate. So what happens when we have one enzyme or multiple enzymes and two substrates? So these are two substrate reactions. So there's a couple of different things we have to consider. One of them is the order in which they bind. So that's the kinetic mechanism, the order of binding and release of the product. So most biochemical reactions are going to fall in this two substrate reaction. So first we're going to give you the more simplified form. Did that seem simplified, guys? No, not really. But that was the more simplified form. So now we're going to look at two substrate reactions, and that really is going to encompass most of your biochemical reactions, because very rarely do we just have one substrate and one enzyme. Oftentimes you have two substrates and then one enzyme that's acting on it. So again, most of these you can either have them be sequential, so all substrates have to bind before any product gets released. This has become important when we talk about inhibitors. Or you can have the formation of some kind of a ternary complex, which can either be random or ordered. Or you can have a double displacement, which means that you're forming the formation of a substituted enzyme intermediate. And we'll look at all of those when we talk about inhibitors. So if we want to look at our E and S diagrams again, this is what that looks like. We have, here's our complex. Here's the random order, meaning it doesn't matter which binds first and which binds second. It can be random. So you have your enzyme, enzyme substrate 1, enzyme substrate 1, 2, and enzyme substrate 2. So that's a random order because you can see that things go back and forth. Here's very ordered. Enzyme binds substrate 1, produces this intermediate. Then it binds substrate 2, produces this intermediate, and then it changes to the product. And then we have enzyme reactions where there's no ternary complex, and that is here. So we never form this multi-substrate complex with the enzyme. We instead are releasing product along the whole way and forming the substrates independently. So we have multiple enzyme substrate complexes or multiple transition states. So when we look at sequential ordered reactions, here's an example of one. We have pyruvate, which we'll talk a lot about pyruvate, plus NADH. What's NADH? NAD is actually NAD plus. What's that classified as? A cofactor. So start recognizing when you see these cofactors in different reactions. And that gives us lactate. Now we talked about lactate yesterday, right? It's what makes our muscles start burning when we're working out, and we're not used to that. So a coenzyme binds first, and lactate is always released first. So here we've got our enzyme. We have NADH, pyruvate. So we make our enzyme pyruvate complex, and then we have our enzyme lactate complex, and then we have lactate, and it releases. And so the substrate binds the enzyme in a very defined sequence. So that's a sequential order reaction. So this one, again, we have creatinine. We've got our ATP. ATP is serving as not only an energy source, but also a cofactor here. And then we are going to get phosphocreatinine over here with ADP. So again, the order of enzyme binding doesn't matter here. We end up having creatinine, enzyme, ATP, and so it doesn't really matter. And this, when you look at reactions like this is called Cleland notation. I only mention that because there are a couple questions on some of the finals that actually call it Cleland notation. I've never heard of it other than that. So when we talk about sequential kinetic mechanics or mechanisms, they're really hard to distinguish from random ordered. So random mechanisms in equilibrium give an intersection point on the y-axis. So remember x, y. And the Lineweaver-Burke plots is what you're looking at right now, and the lines all intersect. So that indicates you've got a sequential mechanism when those conditions happen if you're looking at a Lineweaver-Burke plot. When we've got a double displacement, this can also be considered a ping-pong reaction. You might hear that weird term at some point. But in a double displacement, you have this type of example. You've got aspartate, alpha-ketoglutarate, which goes to oxaloacetate and glutamate. So one or more products are released before all substrates are binded to the enzyme. So you've got your enzyme, binds aspartate, and then you release oxaloacetate, and then you end up having binding to alpha-ketoglutarate and release glutamate. So it's almost like two separate reactions, but they consider them as a single reaction. And this is called a ping-pong reaction because your enzyme bounces back and forth between binding substrate, producing product, then it binds new substrate, produces new product. So ping-pong type reaction. This is a double displacement. This is what a Lineweaver-Burke plot looks like with a ping-pong mechanism. So you know that this is ping-pong mechanism because the lines are all parallel. They never intersect. We can also talk about allosteric enzymes, and I'll show you an example of this in a little bit. But allosteric enzymes are multiple subunits, multiple active sites, and then essentially one substrate comes in, binds the enzyme, changes the enzyme at a different active site, so they have a cooperative substrate binding, and so you get this type of sigmoidal curve.
It's very similar to hemoglobin binding, rate of cooperative.
That's cooperative binding.
Yeah, when heme binds with hemoglobin, you get cooperativity. Cooperativity, cooperative binding, where the first oxygen binds more cooperatively. First one binds okay, the second one binds decreasing affinity. Third one binds more affinity, and fourth one binds more. That's if you're changing the shape of the protein. And as the shape of the protein changes, it increases the affinity as well. That's what you're talking about an allosteric enzyme has multiple sites.
And these are usually highly regulated. Okay, so we'll do one more case study, and then we'll take a break and come back and do Pymol. So Mr. Smith is 65 years old and 235 pounds. Recently, he's been experiencing fatigue, muscle pain, and weakness. He has a history of high cholesterol that can no longer be controlled with diet and exercise, so he began taking lovastatin 2 months ago, and his cholesterol is now within the healthy range. However, his type 2 diabetes also remains under control without the use of insulin. He's had no sudden weight gain or weight loss, but why is he experiencing these new symptoms of fatigue, chronic muscle pain, and weakness? Potassium is a good guess. Not quite right, but it's a good guess. Magnesium. I love that you guys are thinking about these kind of minerals. It's not magnesium either. This is one that's a little bit more obscure. He's hangry. He's hangry all the time. Think about the mechanism of statins. What do statins do? Yeah, it helps with your cholesterol. Not quite. So remember, statins bind a very specific enzyme to block that cholesterol pathway. So it turns out, we'll get to this in a minute, but by blocking part of the cholesterol pathway, you block the production of CoQ10. So, and that can lead to muscle pain, weakness, and it's more, they think it's anecdotal, they don't know for sure, but they know that they see a decrease in CoQ10, and it's often associated as side effects are muscle weakness and pain. So remember that cholesterol, 75% of it is made in your liver, 25% comes from the food that you eat. Here's your total healthy cholesterol. You should also think about your triglyceride HDL ratio. But here's some of the interesting parts about statins. 32 million Americans are on statin, which is equivalent to almost the entire populations of Florida and Illinois combined. It's a lot of people on statins. You will interact with statins as pharmacists. So remember, statins can also be metabolized by CYP3A4, which we talked about before. So if we block CYP3A4 with grapefruit juice, or if we block CYP3A4 with erythromycin, then we're going to increase the plasma concentration of our statins. to a dangerous level or a toxic level perhaps. But in this case, that was not actually what was happening. So here's lovastatin, and it actually, here's a couple different statin drugs. Here's lovastatin down here. Here's our intermediate in the cholesterol synthesis pathway. And so we can see, here's our different drugs, and this just tells you what your R groups are. We have a mimic. So we're going to mimic the transition state. And lovastatin is going to come in and mimic that transition state and block the transition state. And so this is part of what's part of the way it's acting is by blocking that transition state. And we can see that very clearly when we look at the intermediate in cholesterol synthesis. Yep, you want to know for its mechanism of action that it's mimicking the transition state. So here is, again, the enzyme that it's working with is an HMG-CoA reductase. And so the inhibitors, pretty much all statins that I could find actually block right here, which blocks this intermediate and which would normally progress to cholesterol or coenzyme Q10. Now you may have heard about a lot of people taking CoQ10. Have you guys heard about CoQ10 as a nutritional supplement perhaps? So it turns out that if you're taking, there's kind of a controversy about if you're taking statins, should you take CoQ10? Because CoQ10 plays a central role in electron transport. And because it plays such a central role in electron transport, we can see changes with energy level. We can see changes with oxidative state and a variety of different things. And so here's an example of what happens to CoQ10 levels when your statin is started and then your statin is stopped, and it drops quite significantly. And so it's definitely something that you should keep up with, because I don't know if there's a general recommendation. There's some papers that say one thing and there's some that say something different, but as a pharmacist, this would be something that maybe you should keep up on, is whether or not it's recommended for CoQ10 to be taken with statins, because if we're stopping this, we're stopping cholesterol production, but we're also stopping coenzyme Q10, which is really important in oxidative phosphorylation or in your oxidative electron transport chain. So we'll take a quick break and allow Ben to get set up for Pymol, and he's actually going to look at that enzyme and show you how the enzyme works.
Agreed. So when I get
If you do a quick Google search for HMA or HMG-CoA reductase and statin, PDB, you will get the crystal structure of a statin bound to an HMG-CoA reductase. Happens to be a dimer, and this is labeled LVA, and I think it's lovastatin, but I actually didn't spend the time to look and see if that was the structure, but it looks like it. Yeah, so if you wanted to get, I actually have never had anyone do, we've done hundreds of videos. I've never had anyone do statins, which is kind of interesting to me, considering that they are a significant portion of drugs prescribed. If you want to look at the ligand interaction, you can, again, see all the different types of bonds that exist, and you can see the binding site and which residues are important in the binding site. But
remember that your lipid for Crestor, these are statins, so very common drugs that you'll see.
for Pymol 1T02, this is what it looks like. And you can see that, let me get this to be a little bigger. You can see where it's going to bind. I'll show you some different commands. There's different ways of doing this. I have a tendency just to go to hide everything and then show only the polymer. But if you go to hide non-bond, you do have to type it correctly. It will hide all of the red molecules, which are probably water and other things that are not important. So that's it. And you can see now that this molecule is a lot more clean. This, we can also hide this if you want. If I click on lovastatin, I can show it as a sphere. You can see where it kind of sits in there. If I right-click on it, I can show, or color, sorry. Color it. Oh, why did it do that? Color by element. I can get kind of a nice little idea of how it sits in there. If I show this as a surface, oh, I always do that. You can kind of see how it sits in, how the statin sits in there in that active site. So generally I try to do drugs in Pymol that I'm going to show you on the exam. And would this be a competitive inhibitor or non-competitive inhibitor? They don't know. Oh, that's true. We don't know the terms. Well, I'll introduce the concept to you. I forgot that we didn't do that. That's actually next. That's the next day. So I'm introducing a concept right off the bat, so before you know it. So this is a competitive inhibitor because it's binding the same site as the substrate would normally bind, which kind of makes sense, right? It competes for the same site. So a non-competitive inhibitor would bind at a different site. That could actually allosterically change the enzyme or cause some other kind of interaction that allows the enzyme to be less effective. So lovastatin sits in the middle of this. This is the active site of the enzyme. It looks like a lot of the other enzymes. Hopefully you're starting to get the idea. The reason we go over this and over this and over this and over this is so you get an idea of how this actually looks in real life and how drugs actually interact at the biochemical level. I think that's a really important thing to kind of drill in. If you want to take out this molecule, I can extract this, or I have it selected right now, so I can go in here and I can click Extract Object. That'll make it Object 1 here. I can also go in here and click Extract Object. just select it actually. Chain A plus chain B, that's this guy, so I can click extract object. So now I have an object 1 and an object 2. I can right click here, click, or actually I could do it over here, drag matrix, shift, and if I move, did I not hit that? Drag matrix. Awesome. There, I can move it over there. So now I can move it out, and then if there is a video, I'll show you real quick on how to, and Adam does a really good job of describing how to do this. This is literally, it's a 5-minute watch, so you don't really have to spend a lot of time to get this down in order to understand how this works. So if you go in Integrity, I apologize, I didn't realize that these weren't posted until yesterday. There's PyMol editing for 3D printing, if you're interested in doing that. PyMol video help, how to rock or mutate a molecule. The PyMol tutorials 1, 2, and 3 go over the basics, which I constantly go over. Video creation tutorial, so you guys ask questions about what people make the videos in, and I show you how to do it in Integrity, PowerPoint. I don't think I show you how to do it in iMovie or whatever the Mac is, but I show you those two options. I show you how to label molecules. And then this moving molecule movies, that's actually, it shows you how to do things, literally an 8-minute video. So you can actually take the stuff I'm doing right now, you can make this video in about, literally a couple minutes. And if you're struggling with it, Adam and I can help you get this thing set up pretty quickly and efficiently for your extra credit that you're trying to do. So I'm showing replacement, yes, sorry. Anyway. Any questions? Yep. It depends on how much you want to do with it. So the stuff you're going to be doing with it, it's totally free and you can use it for as long as you want. It's an educational license, I'll give it to you. Like all the crap that I do with it, I buy a license, it's like $100 a year. So it's a pain in the butt, but it, for your purposes, you can download it for free. They don't. And don't ask IT, because they'll just freak out at you. So anyway. So this is kind of the idea. If I look, so you're going to want to create different objects for it. You're going to want to extract it, and then you could get in and start to see. This is a competitive inhibitor. This lovastatin structure is very similar to what you're going to see, and you can find it inside this active site. One of the things when you're looking for, if you're looking for something, you're definitely going to want to have something that's co-crystallized, and then you can make this and drag this out, right? And then you can get a good idea of how to put it back in with that movie that I just showed you. So type some commands in, and you're good to roll. You guys have any questions? Yeah, I think it's funner than hell. Yes, I really like it. If you want to 3D print something, all you have to do is send me the file, and I have grab the file, grab it, and print it for you. Because I'll say send it to me, and then I'll just send it to her and be like, "Did you send this?" That's exactly what they did. But if you're going to use PyMol, or to get something to 3D print, you have I understand that. You're not. Statistics, and you have to learn R or something, right? It's just a byproduct of what you're. Every day, you're gonna. We do it every. Extent. I like to see. It makes so much more sense to me when I see a drug. We put a lot of this stuff, and we put these drugs, and they're flat on a screen. They're not flat. It's going to take 10, 15 minutes for us to do that. It's not like you're going to invest hours and hours trying to learn it. We can just walk you through it, or we can even just help you do it. No big deal. It is a good question.
So we could see that in some of them.
Ask more questions. So the second, hey, talk, okay? So let's just go back to this, right? So if I go back to the website, you don't understand the chains here. So, okay, so this says macromolecules. These are chains of proteins. HMA-CoA reductase is a dimer, so it's got a chain A and a chain B. That means it's two different proteins. So you're talking about a quaternary structure. Does that make sense? So far? Okay. Small molecules, right? This is your drug. Right here. That's the chemist's name for it, right?
And then you can see over on the left-hand side it says IDLVA. So that's how you know what you're looking for when you go into that sequence.
When you go into Pymol, I'm looking for LVA. No, that's what I highlighted it, so it'll look like.
It'll look like that, yeah.
You just have to drag. You have to use a slider bar and go find it. More. Go ahead. That's what this website will tell you, right? This website will the PDB website will tell you what all of these are.
So he looked at on the PDB website, he searched for specific enzymes, and then he looked for.
Actually, not in the PDB. Do not look on the PDB.
Oh, that's right.
I use Google. I use Google because Google's way better. So I typed in HMA-CoA reductase and statin.
So he wanted one that had a drug with it. So you put in the name of the enzyme and the name of the drug you're looking for. And you search for that, and it'll come up with a whole bunch of ones.
And they're crystallized together. So you could probably find HMG-CoA reductase without the statin. But I found the one with the statin because that's the one I wanted to look for. So if I type, usually if you just type a drug, so if I just typed in statin and PDB, yeah, see this shows up too. So you don't, if you just type the drug and PDB, you'll probably find something like this. Or class of drug, you'll find it.
So for our video, you can only put 8.5 would be a
Well, you're all pharmacists. Why wouldn't you do drugs?
Okay, so like I just Googled like gabapentin CBD and there's like 3 or 4 different things that I can fetch.
Yeah.
But I just keep like,
Well, okay, so that's you're gonna might have to do a little bit of research, and if you have trouble with that, come find me and we can talk through it, and I can show you exactly where if it's gonna work or not gonna work. But that's generally the idea. Yeah.
I don't know what enzyme I don't know, you just search like what you want to study and it should tell you.
Well, I would go to Wikipedia, right? So let's just say let's just say I'm looking up Humira, right? And I don't know what I know nothing about what Humira does. Does anyone know what Humira does? What its target is? It's for the indication is psoriasis it's got a lot of indications, right? But psoriasis is one. Plaque psoriasis is one of them, right? It's also for things like Crohn's disease. It's an it decreases. Yeah. So Humira, if you look, you can find all kinds of stuff on their website. But I would look at the Wikipedia, and the actual name is adalimumab, right? And this nomenclature actually means something. So as you get into pharmacy, I think in the first half of the biotech course, you learn what this is. MAB stands for monoclonal antibody.
The only thing that answers MAB is if you know what the antibody is.
And you know that MU stands for mouse. Oh, I know that. So that's murine antibody. And then the LI, I don't remember what that stands for. Do you remember what it's like? Chimera or something. There's a nomenclature associated with drugs that you can actually sit there and look at. But if I just wanted to know what, yeah. So if I wanted to know what this adalimumab, sold on a trade name Humira, common indications are rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, blah blah blah, Crohn's disease, all kinds of other diseases. Humira is a TNF inhibiting anti-inflammatory biological medication. This is what it looks like. It's an antibody. That's what antibodies look like. If you flatten them out, it doesn't look like that, anything like that in real life or in tertiary structure, but that's how we like to look at them. And you can find if I go into Humira PDB, this is the #1 drug the top selling drug right now is Humira. It's and it targets TNF alpha, so 3WD5 is the crystal structure that you can use this is the crystal structure fragment alone, and this is the crystal structure fragment of TNF alpha in complex with the antibody.
Also, if you're looking for the protein or whatever the drug that you're interested in interacting with, a lot of times I'll search the drug name and mechanism of action.
Or structure, or any of these other things. It'll tell you exactly. This is the reason we do this, right? So that you can actually come back and have some kind of reasonable discussion about what hopefully it starts to make sense to you a little more. Well, okay, so you can, right? What's the other thing that I care about, right? So I'm a biochemist, so I geek out on if you show me mutations in the target or you show me bonds, I'm going to geek out on the bonds, right? I actually sit there and that's what I do, if you want to know the truth. That's what I do all day long. I look at bonds, and I say, oh, this is a hydrogen bond, this is a, hydrophobic pocket, this is what this is. And I'll analyze all those bond structures. So that's what I like to do. You can do any number of things like that. Do the mutagenesis that I tried to do yesterday. It's really not that hard. But you can do any number of things to show what's going on in the disease. Like, is anyone want to do Alzheimer's? No? Have you thought about things? So Alzheimer's is the classic one that you could just totally rock with, because I already showed you how to do that, right? I showed you the secondary structure differences between A beta in the normal form and then the malignant form. And then we've also talked about beta secretase and the differences between, how it cleaves it off differently and all the. So you can spend, Alzheimer's is a classic, easy one to do. Actually, I'm really interested in someone who wants to do statins. I have never seen anyone do statins. And that really surprises me because it's such a prevalent. I can't imagine, you guys probably aren't on statins, but like all your parents are probably on statins. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've talked PIMOL, we've talked equations. Now let's get on to inhibition. Because again, this is where a lot of our drugs are coming from, are inhibitors of enzymes. So there are, in general, two different kinds of inhibitors. There are reversible inhibitors and irreversible inhibitors. So irreversible inhibitors are going to bind covalently, or it could be non-covalently, but if they're non-covalently bound, they're going to have this negligible dissociation constant, which means that they're essentially just going to stay there. And so that's kind of what you see there. And then you've got reversible ones. And oftentimes these are rapidly dissociating enzyme inhibitor complexes. And within that category, there are actually 4 different ones we're going to talk about. 3 are listed here. You've got competitive, so the inhibitor is structurally similar to the substrate and binds to the active site. Structurally similar is going to be a cue here for you to indicate that it's competitive. You've got uncompetitive, where the inhibitor only binds to the transition state or the ES complex. So that means that your substrate is going to bind, and then your inhibitor is going to come along and bind. And then you've got non-competitive, where the inhibitor binds, either the enzyme or the substrate enzyme complex. So it can bind either one, which means that it doesn't really matter if it's binding before the substrate or after the substrate. And then the one that's not shown up here is mixed, and we'll talk about what mixed means. And really it just means that there's a characteristic of competitive and non-competitive. And so these are just a quick description of what each one of those looks like, and now we'll go through each one. But to start out with, if I showed you dihydrofolate and methotrexate, can you tell me what type of inhibitor methotrexate will be? Yes. It's going to be competitive because, see, it's got structural similarity. So it looks very similar, even though we have some differences here. The structure overall is going to look similar. We saw that yesterday, too, when we looked at some of the structural similarities between, oh gosh, what molecule were we looking at yesterday? Drawing a total blank on it. I've looked at too many molecules today. Anyway, we saw that yesterday, too. So competitive inhibition, again, the dissociation constant of the inhibitor is K sub I, and that is equal to the enzyme times the concentration of the inhibitor divided by the enzyme inhibitor complex. Same thing as if it was a substrate. So, but that's going to be the dissociation constant for the inhibitor. So remember that the smaller that is, the more potent the inhibitor. So small Ki, very impotent inhibitor. And so again, here's your enzyme. You've got your inhibitor. If your inhibitor binds, you have the constant K sub I. Then you cannot bind your substrate. So otherwise, your substrate binds and produces your product. So you're locking up your enzyme with your inhibitor. It cannot bind and go through this pathway. It's an either-or situation. When we look at the Lineweaver-Burke plot, you can see that here we have our competitive inhibition. This is your uninhibited enzyme, and these are different concentrations of your competitive inhibitor. But note where it crosses here. These all intersect right on the axis. That indicates a competitive inhibition. You'll see this when we go through the different types of inhibition, how this intersection changes location. And then you can also see over here, when we look at the non-Lineweaver-Burke plot, how if you have no inhibitor, it's in black. If you have a concentration of inhibitor is equal to Ki, you've got green. If it's 5 Ki, and you just keep going down here as your substrate goes up. Remember that Km, or the Michaelis constant, in the presence of an inhibitor is called Km ap, and it is increased. And that's shown here. So in uncompetitive inhibition, again, the enzyme inhibitor substrate complex doesn't form the product. So we have our enzyme here sitting in the center. You can have your substrate come in and bind, and it's going to bind back and forth here to give you that enzyme substrate transition state, and that can go onto the product. But if your inhibitor binds at an alternative site, so this could be allosteric, it doesn't have to be, but if your inhibitor comes in here and binds, and your substrate is bound, you cannot progress. You can only go back and forth to this way. So that's your enzyme substrate complex plus your inhibitor. Again, your rate at which that's happening is K sub I, and then you get the complex of all of those. So remember that in this case, your Vmax, in the case of the inhibitor, is lower. So Vmax is lower, and the Km is lower. So the Michaelis constant is lower. This also cannot be overcome by additional substrate. So we can't overcome this inhibition by just dumping more substrate in. So this is what that looks like, but really what is interesting is this is the uncompetitive inhibition. So you can see that they never cross in uncompetitive inhibition if you're looking at a Lineweaver-Burke plot. So in non-competitive inhibition, you kind of form this interesting complex here that goes back and forth. So again, the inhibitor can bind to free enzyme. Here's your enzyme here. Your inhibitor can bind to free enzyme, or it can bind to the enzyme substrate complex. But the only way that your product is produced is if it only binds to substrate. So that's shown up here. Again, V sub max is lower, and you can see that again over here. Your Km is not changed in non-competitive. In uncompetitive, it's lower. Non-competitive, it's not changed. But again, you can't overcome this by increasing your substrate concentration. And you can see here, for non-competitive, we have an intersection down here on our x-axis. So there's uncompetitive, they never intersect. Here's competitive, where they're intersecting on your y-axis. So you can see the difference between these. So allosteric inhibitors, again, can be considered in some cases non-competitive inhibitors. So you have your allosteric regulator, which when one binds, it changes the shape of the other thing. So allosteric activation is where you're actually changing the site to become active and to allow that binding event. Whereas allosteric inhibition or deactivation is the active site becomes unavailable to the substrate when your regulatory molecule comes in and binds. So we can allosterically both inhibit and activate just based on the different molecules that come in. And oftentimes that's going to be indicative that there's going to be a change in shape. So then we've got our mixed inhibition. Now our mixed inhibition is depicted this way. So in our mixed inhibition, we've got our inhibitor and we've got our substrate, and then we've got our enzyme. Now our enzyme is going to be able to bind our substrate or bind our inhibitor, and it could even bind both. But when both are bound, it prevents this enzyme from clamping down, in this case, on the substrate and completing the reaction. So the complete reaction depends on this inhibitor not being there, because you can tell that it couldn't actually clamp down if that was there. So in a mixed inhibition, you can see that we're not on either one of our axes when we see our overlap, and you can see that our uninhibited enzyme is here, and we get our overlap there. So reversible inhibitors, we can actually distinguish based on their kinetics. Here again, you can see, here's the equation for the double reciprocal plot, so the Lineweaver-Burke plot, and the presence of a competitive inhibitor is shown here. And in an uncompetitive inhibitor, it's shown here, which, because of the difference in these equations, you see this difference here. And this is kind of your cheat sheet. If you remember this one, you're doing pretty good. So this is your cheat sheet. Remember, competitive inhibition, your Km is increased, your Vmax is unaffected, and you have an overlap right here. Uncompetitive inhibition, your Km is reduced, your Vmax is reduced, you have no intercept. They don't cross. In your non-competitive, which they're considering as mixed here as well, because it looks pretty much the same, your Km is unaffected, and your Vmax is reduced. And you end up having an overlap or an intercept on your x-axis. So if you can remember this part, you're doing pretty good. So then we have what's called suicide inhibitors. Now a suicide inhibitor means that it's going to come in and it changes, it allows the enzyme to change it so that it basically locks it in place. And it can't ever leave, and it cannot go and inhibit in any other place. So here's a suicide inhibitor. This is a drug called Deprenyl, and it's a suicide inhibitor of monoamine oxidase. So this is an MAOI. Have you guys heard about MAOIs before? MAOIs we talk about a lot because they can interfere with a lot of different drugs. So you'll see MAOIs a lot when you talk about drug interactions. So in an MAOI, this one's used to treat Parkinson's disease. Here in Parkinson's, you can see that we don't have as much dopamine in our neural cleft as we do in our healthy condition. So when we kind of blow that up a little bit more, our MAOI is going to come in here, and this is Selagelene, which is the trade name for Deprenyl, I'm pretty sure. That comes and it blocks right here and prevents the production of neurotransmitters. So if you prevent the production of neurotransmitters, you're not necessarily preventing the release, so you're not preventing them from entering the neural cleft, but you're preventing them from actually being produced. So that's, in some cases, how MAOIs can work. Anyway, so this is a suicide inhibitor, and it converts it to this irreversible. You take a reversible, converts it to an irreversible. Penicillin is another great one that we can think about. So this, again, we've talked quite a bit about penicillin. So here's our reactive peptide bond in the beta-lactam ring. And it's going to basically step in and prevent the sugar chain from forming through preventing the cross-linking, the peptide cross-linking. And so it proceeds to the Cecile enzyme intermediate. And we can see that here. If you can answer these questions that I have in here that we're not going through, you're doing pretty good at learning about penicillin and understanding how that is working as an inhibitor. So again, these yellow bonds are similar conformations. So here's our penicillin, and this is the structural piece in the cell wall. So this is a D-alanine peptide, and penicillin mimics that, and it comes right in. So by mimicking that, it's looking structurally similar. So is it going to be a competitive inhibitor or non-competitive or uncompetitive or mixed? Competitive, yeah. So, and not only is it competitive, but it's also considered a suicide inhibitor. Because the enzyme is going to change and it participates in its own inhibition. So the serine residue that sits right here in this active site, so you've got kind of got this catalytic triad here, right? And so serine is going to sit here in the center. It attacks the carbonyl carbon of the lactam ring. So this is your lactam ring, and it's breaking that apart, and it attaches right here. And because the enzyme is actually attaching to the penicillin, it's participating in its own inhibition. And so it's changing penicillin, and now penicillin is not going to leave this active site because it has this bond right here. So that's how suicide inhibitors work. The enzyme itself gets tricked into participating in its own inhibition. And then we have multiple conformations can exist of an enzyme, and they can exist in equilibrium. So again, each one of these is going to have slightly different regulatory properties, but they exist in some sort of equilibrium with certain enzymatic activity. So 20% of the enzyme population may exist here, and its enzyme activity may end up being even greater or less. So again, we can get this whole range of species based on their enzyme activity, based on the way that they're being regulated, and that will change when we do our drug design, how we design drugs, and how are we targeting those drugs to get there. So questions about inhibitors. You will have a lot of inhibitor questions on your test tomorrow. I'll just tell you that right now. So understand the different types of inhibitors, understand your Lineweaver-Burke plots, and be able to kind of go through your Michaelis-Menten types equations, particularly with the substitutions, so that if I give you Vmax, you can calculate, if I give you Vmax and substrate concentration and enzyme concentration, you could calculate V naught. You could calculate the initial velocity. Questions? Okay, I'm going to post these slides because, again, I did make some changes, so I'll post these up. In fact, I'll do it before I leave class right now. I always forget, but I will do it right now so that you guys have this for you tomorrow. Otherwise, we're going to end a little early. Okay, have a good night, you guys.